Welcome to Centering Conversations, where we dive deep into transformative dialogue with thought leaders, change agents, and visionary minds shaping the future of philanthropic leadership. Each episode, we explore the power of voice, the clarity of vision, and the courage of value-driven leadership. Voice, Vision, Value invites you to join this powerful journey towards impact and inspiration. Today's guest on Centering Conversation is Lauren Casteel. Lauren Casteel is the president and CEO of the Women's Foundation of Colorado. Upon joining the foundation in 2015, she became the first person in Colorado to lead 3 separate foundations and is nationally known for her leadership and dedication to excellence in philanthropy. Throughout her career, Lauren has launched many successful initiatives and has been a mentor to many. She is an inspirational leader coming from a family legacy of change makers. She received numerous accolades throughout her career, including the Colorado Women's Chamber 25 Most Powerful Women Award, the Girl Scouts Women of Distinction Award, and Colorado's Women Hall of Fame inductee. This conversation shares her personal perspectives, which may not necessarily reflect the views or the positions of the Women's Foundation of Colorado. We welcome her into this conversation where we talk about her career, the legacy that she is leaving, and what is ahead for her. I'm so excited to have you on Centering Conversations, where we amplify the leadership of Black women that are leading in philanthropy. You are certainly one of them, one that has been in this work for a long time, someone that I cannot wait to have a conversation on because I want to know, how did you last this long? What have you learned? Has it been all of what you imagined? Did you leave it all on the table? All of those types of things, because it is an interesting sector that we have put our leadership into.
Yes, it is. And I'm so honored to have been asked by you and, of course, Toya to be a participant in this. I think the wisdom isn't really about me. It's about the community and the dialogue. I wish there were 100 women that I were listening to at this point in time, because I am still a learner at this point in my life.
And I started out saying, sort of the tenure of your time in this space and how did you survive it? And I say that with all the love that I have for philanthropy and knowing that there's women that are sitting in different industries and different sectors that, longevity, as I say, longevity has its place. And, survive in terms of all the things that you had to navigate. And I think it's also important that we talk about the ways in which we've thrived and who has supported you and sort of leading in the best ways. And we love to say their names on this podcast because it's such a useful reminder that we don't navigate life alone.
It's interesting. When you started speaking, I pulled up in the Centering Ourselves report, that first page that listed the names of all of the Black women that had paved the way and certainly paved the way for me, and then the beloved sisters who are no longer with us. So I really honor your acknowledging the need to say their names. And right now, in this moment, I'd like to, lift up the name of Gladys Washington, but everyone who is on that list has certainly given me sustenance, whether or not they knew it or whether or not I knew all of them personally, but certainly many I did. And I'm thrilled to be with you.
I am too excited to talk to you. And, Gladys Washington was also one of the Black women that we got to feature in this podcast. And when I came into philanthropy, and you said Toya's name, when I came into philanthropy, I had met Toya not long before. And she heard that I was moving into a role. And she said, there's a space that I think you ought to be in. And I want to sponsor you into this Black Women in Philanthropy retreat. And I just did not know the gift that she was giving me. It was nice, but I didn't understand sort of the rippling impact of that gift. And one of that gifts that I received from that was meeting Gladys. And I'm like, she is a force. And there's something that's so relatable and fierce about the way that she approaches the work. And she allowed me in a new space to sort of sit down the armor of protection, and just be in a really curious space and to be in a space that fed my spirit.
You know, when you say the words armor of protection and curious, both of those expressions really strike me. So, were you talking about the ABFI retreat?
I was, yeah.
Okay, okay. Sadly for me, I only attended one. Our major fundraiser is right at the same time, and I missed it greatly every year. There was a certain hole and longing that I had within my spirit about not being there with you. But the time that I did attend was glorious, absolutely glorious.
Yeah, they were sort of not really ahead of their time, but in some ways ahead of their time in curating space for us just to lay it on the table what we're navigating and to honor those experiences and to create community that allows us to see us in our full selves, to walk back into the spaces that we're navigating, whether or not it's within those institutions or whether or not it was in community or whether or not it was in our families. So one of the other words that you used, I think, was the legacy of those that came before us, right? With the names being expressed in the report that you mentioned, centering ourselves. As I prepared for this conversation, in the season we are,
And I am not prepared. So yes.
we are prepared with whatever we got today because we're coming through an election season that has created a lot of angst from almost the beginning in terms of what was going to happen in terms of the future of this country, the rights that so many people have, surrendered a lot of their time, their lives, relationships in order to advance progress in our country. And you are coming from a pretty outstanding legacy. And we touched on it a little bit, but I am just curious in a time like this, what are you reflecting on given your family, your history, and what you were surrounded by in your formative years, and perhaps just share a little bit of that with our listeners?
Well, of course, thank you for asking. And before we end, I do have in the current context a charge for philanthropy that I'd love to share, to read with you, that I presented just the other day. But for those who don't know, I am the youngest daughter of Whitney Moore Young Jr., and my father was considered one of the big six of the civil rights movement. Many people used to refer to the big four, and they were excluding Dorothy Height and John Lewis. John Lewis because he was young, Dorothy Height because of her gender as a Black woman. But my father was one of all of the civil rights leaders who gathered for the signing of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. He was an architect of the war on poverty. He was an architect of affirmative action, what he referred to as the domestic Marshall Plan. My father had served in World War II in an all-Black troop, as so many of our ancestors who served in the war. And that's important to note, the day after Veterans Day that we were actually taping this were those Black soldiers. And on his way back, he wrote every day a handwritten letter to my mother and ultimately concluded that instead of being a doctor, which had been his plan, that he would in fact devote his life to race relations. And his goal at that time was really what we would call today economic equity, the domestic Marshall Plan, that we redistribute resources to those who have been most marginalized historically and systemically, had lives defeated and, pathways that had been denied and barriers presented against them, the history of Black folks. And so that was the legacy into which I grew. My father took over the National Urban League when I was probably about, oh, geez, 8, I want to say, in 1961. We moved from the segregated South, segregated Atlanta, Georgia, and he got a fellowship to Harvard for a year. And then we moved to New York when he took over the Urban League. So I grew up, I was young, but everywhere I was hearing about the need for civil rights, the need for economic equity, the need to eliminate and to move beyond racism for Black people. Similarly, he grew up in the context where my grandparents had what was called Lincoln Institute, a large school in rural Kentucky where they were supposed to be teaching young Black students agricultural and domestic arts. Instead, they taught reading, writing, arithmetic. So even agriculture is reading, writing, arithmetic, math, physics, all of the above. And most of them went on to historical Black colleges and universities. So even from my grandparents on my father's side and my mother's side, my mother came from a legacy of teachers within her family. It was all about how do we lift up our people? How do we use the privileges that we had in order to ensure that others had the opportunities that we had? And then the last thing that I'd mention, and we can get back to this later, but in the segregated South and an all Black neighborhood where I lived for 8 years, I didn't know I was learning philanthropy, but this is so true. When we think about Valeta's book, right? We all experienced philanthropy within our families and within our communities in ways that were informal and not formal, institutional. And I think maintaining the heart of that is really important. So, yes, rights are in my DNA. My father, I am confident right now, if in fact people roll in their graves, would be devastated at the time that the Civil Rights Bill was signed or the Voting Rights Act. I know the perception was that these were building blocks for the future. These were building blocks, that there would be the kind of regression and retrenchment that we are vulnerable to right now and have evidence of would have been incomprehensible.
I'm not just hearing that, I'm feeling it. There's something about how I imagine, how I have witnessed sort of the racial violence and what was happening in the country that they were fighting through. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of committing their lives to that movement. The other thing that's in my head, I'm going to try and be articulate about it. The other thing was in my mind is, I think it was on the mountaintop or something, the mountaintop. It was a documentary with Martin Luther King. And he was sort of leaning on the staircase and he was talking about the violence of the North. Mm-hmm. And the subtleties of the racial violence of the North. And so maybe what I'm thinking about is that the building blocks, in some ways, perhaps racism has just been morphing in ways that we haven't understood as a country, that it's morphing in policy, it's regressing in some ways, moving in some ways. How do you even make sense? Can you make sense of it? Because I can't even ask, I don't even know what to ask you.
Yeah, I mean, if I could make sense of it, I would not be sitting in this little office in my house right now.
Yeah.
We would not need to have this conversation. I think we are all struggling to make sense of it. The bottom line is that we do not live in the country that we thought we would live in. Vincent Harding, Dr. Vincent Harding, who was with the Iliff School of Theology here in Denver, but was a colleague of Dr. King, once said, "We live in a country that is not yet born."
Mm.
And in that quote, there is the hope that we would be born, right? That this embryo is growing, that the opportunity is growing, and that if we came together with the fight, with the clear violence, whether it was dogs or hoses or bombings of churches and babies being killed, and that we would in fact overcome. Think about the lyrics of the Negro national anthem. We have always been a people of faith. We've always been a people for whom freedom was a religion. That and right now, I think we're in a period of time where there's some destabilization of that, um, some demoralization, and perhaps even some immobilizing of that. But the essence of who we are and have been all of these centuries will not change. But what needs to change is how we go about it. So the violence of racism in the North is alive and well. It was subtle, but also demoralizing in so many ways, where one begins to think like, um, you know, am I like crazy? Did that just happen? Right? You
Yeah.
know, did that just did that really just happen? Where there was a perception of safety that in fact was not real. It's been interesting to me how many folks have moved back to the South recently because they feel as though the explicitness and the overtness of racism is easier to deal with than those subtle or perhaps gaslighting other forms. But ultimately, policy and what happens with our policies is essential.
Yeah.
Uh, I worry. My dad used to say to me when I was slapping Free Angela stickers on the refrigerator door, my afro, it's hard to imagine now, was ginormous.
Mhm.
Um, I was making red, black, and green cakes with a friend and selling them on the side. And he was like, okay, do that. I was a part of the Black Awareness Club in my high school and wrote the words supporting that. He said, but don't confuse symbols for substance. And sometimes I think that it's easy to confuse symbols for substance, that we declare victory too soon. And the recent event over the past, in the past week, our country identified itself as not being the country that we thought it was, in a very, very, very clear mandate. And that mandate, interestingly enough, and I don't know how to make sense of, um, involved men, it involved Black men, it involved white women, Latino men, like it. And so this sense that I have, that line from Glory and the movie Selma of, the movement is a rhythm for us, and freedom is a religion for us, around music and how that lifts us, I think has left many of us confused.
I'm super confused. And I think one of the things that I was most sad about was the discussion that I was seeing within community around whether or not Kamala was Black. With so much at stake, I just could not put my mind around how did we get to this place that we're willing to participate in such a ridiculous conversation? Where is it coming from? Why do I think it's ridiculous, and why is it legitimate to other people? Do you have any insight that you can?
It's interesting. I have to give the disclaimer. I am the president and CEO of a nonpartisan organization. We could not take a position. I could not. But if we speak more generally about how we identify and how we accept the identities of others, even within our community, similarly to, whether it's colorism or, the ways in which we internalize oppression and sometimes turn upon ourselves the role of gender within the context of our community as well, and how that can be exploited, that internalized oppression can be exploited by others. That is real. That's not about an individual candidate. That's not just about her. I heard someone say the other day, well, she didn't sound strong. And I'm like, what does that mean? And yet, if she sounded too strong, you and I talked a little bit prior to our actually recording this about an article by Nonprofit Quarterly regarding the tropes of Black women, and whether it's the mammy, the angry Black woman, or the magical superwoman, she kind of embodied all of those. People wanted her to be the caretaker, but then they looked for her being, angry. But then, they wanted her to be the superwoman. But if she'd been the superwoman, then, she would have been angry and then too strong. Our society, the reality is that, within recent generations, the mixed cultures that we're seeing is real. But that does not take away, nor does it give us the right to deny that we can hold both truths. So her Southeast Asian lineage is valuable, as is her Black lineage as well. But when you put those together into women, I think it's confusing. And when one is in an interracial relationship as well, I think that there are long-standing histories of how Black women are supposed to protect our baby boys, right? And remain loyal. So that causes a variety of perspectives. But that aspect and our Blackness remains our Blackness. Within my family, the colors, I'm thinking about a photograph of my father's family and my grandfather's Blackness. If you had asked me at the age of 3, I would have said my grandmother was white, right? She was not. If I had had the subtlety of her features, the children among us are the full range of the hues of Black folks, going back to what happened to our mothers in the context of slavery. And so it pops up in many different kinds of ways. So that's work that we have to do. We have to do. And that's ongoing among ourselves. But if someone says, whoever it may be, I am these things, this is how I identify, believe them.
Believe them.
90% of the time. Now, there are folks who take
There are a
advantage,
couple
they're
we can name.
imposters. There are. But I'm talking about in the general sphere of the world.
Believe them. Believe them. You use the word internalized suppression, right? And how would you define that? Can you define that?
You know, again, if I had the capacity, but I think that that sense of self-hate, there is that history, there is that self-shame that women carry about whether it was rape. Just the other day in my car, I was listening to the song For Women, right? And, you know, all of those women and the violence that had been inflicted upon them in some capacity, and the anger are men for not being able to protect the women not always protecting our men, and yet our maternal instinct. All of that is really complicated. There are people with PhDs and, Black belt. John Hope Franklin could probably, if he were still alive, do a much better job of defining that. But there is something that we do carry, and it's not weakness. I want to be very, very clear. It is not weakness, but just as someone may have experienced domestic violence, and the PTSD that lives on for, oftentimes generations if it's not resolved. This is multi-generational. It doesn't mean we can't heal. And there is evidence of healing within our communities. There is evidence of that, whether it's professional, whether it's psychological, whether it's through the arts, whatever it may be, through community, we do rise up and we do heal. But it has to be intentional. And it also means acknowledging, without being afraid of it, the rage that can lie beneath in a healthy, nonviolent way.
Mm-hmm. Is there a way to move rage to move it to a more productive place?
I think so.
Yeah.
I certainly do think so. When we see, and folks today, young folks might be mortified thinking about, those who in the 60s had hoses turned on them, dogs turned on them, who faced that with nonviolence, as promoted by Martin Luther King and his respect for Gandhi and for others around movements. And but where does it go otherwise, I think, is the question that you're actually asking.
Yeah.
So we can act in a particular way, but where does it go? Back to your previous question, I think it goes within. I think it goes within. But yet, I am not a proponent of violence. I am not. And it has been hard for me, Chanda, to say the words. I'll be honest. It's been hard for me to say, I am angry.
Why?
I'm angry. I think because I have so often in my professional life and, even in, my family life, been the only, right? And been so conscious of that angry Black woman trope because my job was to, open doors and have others come through it. So I didn't want to risk closing doors. But yet I had to express the anger at the same time through the work
Mm.
by advocating for gender, racial, and economic equity, by insisting upon pay equity, by um, hiring and mentoring and supporting people of color. Uh, it wasn't a passiveness by any means, but I wasn't throwing F bombs either. And when we think about the murder of George Floyd and those marches don't solve everything, but they do provide that outlet that is important, that sense of community that is important. But then it becomes difficult when, you're in Minnesota. It becomes difficult when people make promises based on that and then they don't fulfill them.
I am making some assumptions in this, but you obviously got to watch up close and personal how rage and barriers manifested into action and progress.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking a bit on my uncle, who was the first African American superintendent of schools, Richard Green, here in Minnesota, and went on to be the first Black chancellor. And one of the things that I realized as I've gotten older were the leadership lessons that I learned from him through observation. And a couple of things were, the leaders that would be around the table at my grandmother's house,
Mm-hmm.
and it would get quite dynamic, and they'd have their bourbon and all the things, and they'd be
Yeah.
yelling at each other. And
Yeah.
kid, I'm like, are they mad?
Have their bourbon, have a highball.
Yeah, are they mad at each other? And
I'll make it.
then I would see them be like, I love you, man. I support you, man. Whatever, we'll figure it out. And so there was something about leadership that wasn't always polished.
Right.
Right. There was something about how I learned leadership, that it was about people pushing and holding you accountable and arguing a point, that it wasn't always neat, but it was always sort of, around a level of respect for what everyone had to contribute. And I am so grateful for those lessons. And do you see, or can you even express sort of the lessons that you learned in those formative years that informed how you approach your work in community and in organizations?
It's interesting. That's a great question and a great image that you built. One of the things that was very, very clear to me, if we think about the civil rights movement, whether it was the Big Six, and it was really the Big 2000, right? To simply say the six, the eight, the 10, the freedom riders aren't counted in all of that, all of those people. But what I did learn was that each of them understood that they brought a different piece. John Lewis brought the youth. A. Philip Randolph, it was labor. My father, the corporate and the education. Dorothy Height, women. Martin Luther King, faith. Every one of them, and from their perspectives, there could be dynamic conversations that would go on, but each of them recognized and valued what it was that they brought to the table that made them stronger collectively. And in the end, they could all have, their bourbon. Now, my father and Martin split on the Vietnam War. My father wanted the focus to maintain on civil rights and not on the Vietnam War. And as a veteran, was very concerned about the soldiers who were still serving in Vietnam. So there was a split there between the two of them that I think was sad. But I also think about my father, who was the more corporate, and how he and Malcolm X developed a relationship after Malcolm went to Mecca and experienced this collective in the context of his faith, of different people, and being also at the Wailing Wall. My mom and Betty Shabazz were good friends, and so which people would not have necessarily expected, that the two of them would have been, and we didn't live far from each other, and they're buried in the same cemetery, which is interesting to me. I think that part of collective freedom is something I feel very strongly about, is the collective. And what our country right now may have strayed from is that when you're doing well, that helps me to do well. When my neighbor's doing well, that helps them to do well. So I mentioned growing up, in the segregated South, but the lessons were still, from my earliest years. We've all heard the expression of grandma's, pot is never empty. But people sharing food, childcare, elder care, Mrs. Barrett, who took the bus to go clean houses in the white neighborhood before, the bus boycotts, right? And she would walk me to school. That was philanthropy. That was collective. That was, if I got to school, that was better for everybody. And I wonder now if that sense of mutuality, let me call it that, of mutuality, exists as deeply in those ways that we now coin, and everyone says time, talent, treasure, testimonial, and social ties. But what's the meaning of that? And that goes back to, Valeta's book. What does that really look like and feel like?
Mm-hmm. I know that as I've been thinking about where we sit, the word hyper individualism kept coming forward, and people are looking out. And this is not a judgment, and this is not a side, but it is just this idea of, I need to make sure that I'm good. My house is good. We can eat. We can afford things, right? That it becomes very eye-centric and very hyper individualistic. This is what I need. People are trying to take something away from me, and it sits in all kinds of spaces, even outside of politics as we know it and experience it out loud. But do you think that former philanthropy, can play a role in bringing the sense of we all do better when we all do better? Do you think that there's a role for that, or do you think it's become something different than that?
It's hard to tell. As I mentioned earlier, I was receiving the Colorado National Philanthropy Day Lifetime Achievement Award, which basically means I'm an elder. I've been in the field for 35 years consecutively. I began as an executive director in 1990 of a private family foundation that was led by now Ambassador Swanee Hunt. So you have the youngest daughter of Whitney Young, civil rights leader, and the youngest daughter of H.L. Hunt, who was, as Swanee would say, misogynistic, homophobic, anti-Semitic, racist, like all of those things, and very much their history and their legacy being about what can I get from oil or whatever else it might be. And that's not to be disparaging in a rude way. Those are the words and the reason why she and her sister Helen named their foundation Hunt Alternatives Fund was as an alternative to that particular legacy. So when I received this award, it was the day after the definitive election results, or 24 hours after. So I had a night to wrestle with what I was going to say. And the standard is to say Thank you for this opportunity for the people who nominated me, to tell a little bit about how I got there. And I did some of that. But then I said, I'm going to claim elder status. And I told this television host who was the MC, don't come near me until I'm done, right? Because I am going to exceed the time allotted and I'm doing it intentionally, but out of respect and out of concern. So what I said was, and I began in philanthropy. Anna Faith Jones was at Boston Community Foundation, first Black woman I saw in that capacity. Frank Thomas was at four. So here were these really powerful, and me in Colorado, but we were few and far between, right? Jim Joseph was leading the council. What I didn't realize was how few and far between that leadership was, and the role that ABFI played for me to connect me to people and to begin to believe in myself more than I actually believed in myself. I remember thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing right now. There have to be these rules that I don't know. But my own lived experience was of value. So, back to the point, what I shared with the audience was that the summer of 1970, here I am, civil rights movement just a year before my father died. I spent in Czechoslovakia during the Russian occupation. And at that time, and then also in Yugoslavia, I was violently assaulted. And the reason for the assault, I was able to identify the person who assaulted me. He was caught because of the noise that I made, but the assault was violent and occurred. It was because I was young, I was Black, I was American, I was temporarily disabled, I was on crutches, and I didn't speak the language. He was very, very clear. That was the rationale for the assault on me. It makes me think today, as we think about immigrants, right? I was from a different country. I didn't speak the language, and my body was considered to be something that could violate me. I was also in a country that was filled with Russian tanks. That informed my sense of democracy forever, forever. So what I said to the group is, we've all heard that philanthropy means love of humankind. And I'm going to read this now so I don't riff. Philanthropy is also our nation's risk capital. It is our job to be bold, innovative, and courageous in our love and protection of every member of our urban and rural communities, regardless of their backgrounds and identities. Our fearlessness eases the fears of others. It is our responsibility to protect democracy and truth-telling. It is essential that we know the systemic histories that deny opportunity and ensure rights to open, not close doors. Our love compels us to act with passion, compassion, generosity, and kindness, to quote Maya Angelou, to lift up and never hold down members of our community, whether they are seen or unseen, known or unknown to us. Money is not enough. Money's not enough. I remember when I started in philanthropy, the first question, and it still happens, people would say, what's your asset base?
I know.
What's your asset base? Money is not enough. Our resources must celebrate and support nonprofit leaders of movements and services who are working harder and at greater risk than I ever have, right? I'm standing on the stage. These folks with whom I have been in community hearing stories and histories and truths, and sharing meals and crying and laughter and tears, and maybe a little bit of bourbon or maybe tequila. They are working harder and at greater risk than I ever have. We are obligated to name the issues that matter and the people most impacted, whom we trust. No one in the United States of America should have to live in the shadows or the margins simply because of who they are, where they live, or where they come from. Philanthropy is not about sidestepping or self-congratulation. It's about investing in our collective future and freedom. Freedom to live, love, work, and age with grace, to access food, housing, education, and healthcare. Freedom to read any book and to choose whether to have children or not. To feel safe in our bodies and our faiths. There are no higher purposes which our privilege can aspire today and for generations ahead. Think of the young people we know that are in our families, that we rub elbows with, that we listen to. So yes, I grow weary of shedding this. This makes me cry over and over again. I grow weary of shedding ancient ancestral tears. I grow weary of asking, ain't I a woman? Ain't I a woman? My next phase of life, I'm retiring. I got 2.5 months. But as I prepare to retire and take some radical rest, that doesn't mean I'm quitting. And neither will you, nor will people in Colorado, around this country, nor will our true allies who aren't just wearing blue bracelets, but who are doing the work. They will not quit either. We are a country that is not yet born, and we must be its midwives. We must be its doulas. I used to believe it would be in my lifetime that I would transition my life, not my profession, but my life. I'm 71 now, but that I would transition my life with that profound sense that the lives of my grandchildren would be better. And I do believe we will shepherd in new life for this country. I don't know when.
And, thank you for that. What I feel like I am getting, I don't know. I just want to just reach through the screen.
Here we go.
I know. I feel emotional.
Here we go.
I feel it. I feel like crying. And I feel, for you to lay out the legacy of your family and the segregated South and to express the weight that people are holding, it's so striking and it's so profound. And, we started to talk about it a little bit, but one, in terms of philanthropy's responsibility, and you have been in the space for 31 years, leading different types of 35 years.
35.
Pardon the 4 hard years that I left out. But, you've been in that work, and, I am still in spaces where money is in fact centered. There is a value placed on who has money over who doesn't have money, and the centering of ideas and ways that get expressed through philanthropy that could be so much better if we were building spaces for people to come together to understand the roles that you laid out, that, Martin had and John Lewis had, and what is my role in philanthropy? And what is your role in philanthropy? What is my role in this community? What is your role in this community? If we were coming together different and more open without the solutions being set on the front end.
Yeah.
With the level of inquiry and perhaps even some dedication to making sure that we're even examining the right question or the right problem
Yes.
to begin with.
Inquiry and curiosity. And we can't forget, indigenous communities. We can't forget, African immigrants that are coming into this country, in addition to those from our southern borders as well. Uh, I think it was Reverend Barber who said we are a sleeping giant that has yet to awaken. I wish I'd pulled that actual quote, but the concept that he spoke of was there are all these people who, in reality, and it's scary to some, are ultimately the majority of our world, right? BIPOC people are the majority, and that's scary to the system that has existed thus far. And we've seen what that fear hath wrought at this point in time. But that sleeping giant is still there, of those coalitions, of those roles, of those histories, and the inquiry that is necessary, and that we don't apply, that we don't work against each other in some ways, but really understand the history with that trust back again. Who's black, who's not black, who's black enough. I'm looking at myself, my light is all messed up. And, I was talking about 4 women, and I am Sophronia from here to there. I
feel that.
I am Sophronia from here to there.
You're talking about Nina Simone's song, right?
Yes.
Just for those absolutely. That may not know the reference. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But in any case, that sleeping giant, that country not yet born, I have to believe in. And at the same time, we have ancestors who can teach about how we cared for the land. Climate change and climate justice are real.
Yes.
Right? That may not be what we consider oftentimes to be in the foremost, but it is real, and its impact on communities of color is devastating.
Yeah.
It's devastating. Yeah, I remain hopeful. I'm tired. I'll be honest about that, Chanda. Yeah. I'm tired of the ancient and ancestral tears and asking, am I a woman? I'm of the fight, but I'm not quitting. But it will look different for me. And I think it will be being in community and not in the institution, in a different kind of way. I had a chance so I've been with the Denver Foundation, largest community foundation, another private foundation that I led. I'm the only person in the state of Colorado to have led 3 foundations: Family Foundation, Private Foundation, now Community Foundation, the Women's Foundation, and consecutively, right, since 1990. But I went back and I was reading the retrospective of the Hunt Alternatives Fund. And what I wrote about as the CEO for 7 years was that we used to give grants, sometimes based on something written on the back of an envelope or on a napkin.
I love that so much.
I mean, literally, literally, we would decide that we would figure out how the grant would work, who the fiscal sponsor, the 501c3, but based on something that was intangible, that came from a sense of knowing that was far beyond anything that we knew. We did not presume that we knew. And Swanee and I, We would argue about stuff. I mean, there was no question. You talk about dynamic. Um, we would cry, all of those things. I remember ending a grant cycle because we were tiny. Paul Ilveslacker, did I don't know, a little book. There's a name for them. But, small can be powerful. But we went through this grant cycle that we felt really good about, but we had denied babies with AIDS.
Mm.
And and that there was something about that that was so wrenching, so wrenching. But again, that goes back to money is not enough. And thank goodness for those philanthropies that put everything into, like the Diamond Foundation, to finding solutions. They spent down for
Yeah.
AIDS, for example. They
Yeah.
put everything into that. We knew we didn't have enough. So money is useful.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying money's not useful. It is. At the Women's Foundation, we give direct cash assistance um, by supporting nonprofits with general operating unrestricted dollars, and then also giving them money that they can give to their constituents for transportation, for bus, for picking up some rent, for medical copays, for food assistance, whatever it might be, um, in a number of ways, trusting that women know what they need best. And we have a Women and Girls of Color Fund that supports women and gender expansive people of color throughout the state. Our work touches all 64 counties, but throughout the state, who are doing that work, again, that is much harder and at greater risk than I do.
Yeah.
As women of color and gender expansive people in communities in many rural areas, and as well as urban. So, but those become models.
Yeah.
They become models. It's like, uh, positive deviance. You find those
I
uh,
love that.
positive deviance. I
I
love that.
do. I mean, that word just made me happy. I don't
I
know.
know positive deviance is like those little minnows in the rice, right? That
Yeah.
ingredient. That's applicable in so many ways. What is that natural ingredient um, that exists that we would not have otherwise known if we weren't simply listening in community and learning what works from those who know best?
We talked a little bit on the weight of the work at this point, and we have a lot of people that are listening that are either feeling that weight, they are experiencing challenges in the workplace, right? They're trying to express what they are feeling as women, people of color, because the lens is different. And they're often sitting on an island by their own, not feeling supported and not feeling like their experience is validated. And there are a lot of women that are leaving the field.
Yes, there are.
And it feels very concerning to me. And there's a lot of women entering the field, which feels concerning because I feel the pull to figure out how do you support and create and allow for a different tenure. There's also doesn't seem to be, from my point of view, women that are in the work, they're leaving. So that means that they're not moving into that CEO role.
Mhm.
And so I wonder if you could just share a perspective or some advice or some inspiration to whatever lens you want on what I just said. But it has been weighed on my heart quite a bit because through these conversations, I am a vessel of many leadership stories that never make it to air. And there's a lot of pain in this work. And people are moving through pain and still continuing to work to alleviate the pain of others. And it's really quite remarkable. but it is an untold story.
Mm. Well, and there are leaders leaving. It's not just that they don't make it to CEO.
Yeah, that's fair.
CEOs are leaving as well.
Yeah.
We need to be clear about that. And that issue of nonprofit quarterly, and I think the editor of that issue has left as well on Black women. And that particular piece about the wholly impossible, I'm going to call out something else, which is we also don't always support each other.
No.
Right? I mean, if we're going to be really, really honest, and the tensions that one feels of the discernment of the institution and the navigation, I've had staff who was frustrated with me because I was saying we've got to do this step, this step, this step in order to get where we need to go. And ultimately, we got there, abortion being one, before it became the full national debate. But I said, we've got to start here, we've got to start. And it didn't take that long, but people wanted to go from 0 to 100. And even within women's foundations, because of Roe v. Wade, those conversations had not occurred. And so there was frustration that I was moving too slow, that, maybe I was left committed. Well, my dad was on the board of the Federation of Planned Parenthood. It wasn't about commitment. But we don't always support each other. And going back to where you began, if there's inspiration, I think it is in those opportunities to come together. When you talked about the Black Women's Retreat, that's an example. But again, it's the community. It's not just the lectures or the speakers or whatever. Right now, what I am loving most about this is you. I am learning from you. I'm listening to how you speak, to how you think, to what lights you up, to the way you're listening to me. And that is lifting me up. And it's bringing me back to the fact of, my oldest grandsons are, in college. And so, yeah, we got a few years ahead before all of the change. But you are reminding me that if we hold to generations and not to collective freedom and to our collective gifts, and we don't just look for the savior, everybody's looking for the next Martin or Whitney or John Lewis or, Dorothy Hyde, or we are our own, back to that concept, midwives, or there are midwives among us, and that role is equally as important. It's equally as important, that doula who helps us birth the next phase of the movement. So I urge people to find that nonprofit quarterly piece. Maybe you can link it, that whole issue, because we also, and I don't think it's internalized oppression. Some of it is generational. I'm probably more patient than many just because of the years that I have lived. I have stamina. And we need that energy and impatience of others. So how do we bring it together?
How do we bring it together?
It's not an either or. It's not a zero-sum game. How do we, back to all of those names in the report, centering ourselves, like naming those names and understanding their histories and the gifts that were brought to bear. There's so many that I'm looking at. I've mentioned Valeda and Gail Christopher and Jackie Burton and Gloria Prim Brandt, like the list goes, Carol Goss, Anna Faith Jones, I've mentioned. Like, I can't say them all. I won't do justice. And then those who went before. We have to remember our own histories. And I don't know that Black folks fully know our own histories anymore. And we also have to to build those connections. There's so many words now that didn't exist when I began, whether it's extractive or, whatever. What is the heart of that?
Mm-hmm.
What are you feeling in that moment? That's what I want to hear.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you. And, we both talked about the challenge of this moment and just being with you. And, before I was sort of saying I want to reach through the screen, and now I sort of want to fly and sit at your feet.
And if you feed me, I'll fly through and come to you.
And I'm going to have to do that because, and I think the beauty of what you express is it is in the being with each other, right? The listening, the wisdom, the perspectives that you have provided to me in quite a difficult week that are just so meaningful. And, I hope, and as folks are listening, I think it's important to say people's names because often when you feel like you're in it alone, if you just reflect for a moment on the people that you learned from, the people that showed up when you least expected it, the people that allow you to get through the day, like the weight begins to shift to gratitude. And right. And I think that, whenever I'm having, when I was when all my kids, I have 5 of them when they were all little, and, kids were doing kid things and I'm trying to figure out how to figure it out. I'm like, well, these other parents figured it out. Coretta Scott King had them little babies and her husband was all over the place and she had to worry about this. Like I will.
And they all had challenges. We have to remember that too.
They all had challenges, right?
They all had challenges. Malcolm's kids, they all had challenges. We like to memorialize people as perfect. It's the imperfect that we learn from.
And it's so beautiful. And I think that, sometimes when we feel like we can't move forward, for me, it's a reflecting on people who did so much and gave so much to this country that I've benefited from, that if I just reflect for a moment, right, I'm holding something different. I don't want to diminish what I'm holding, but I'm just inviting people as they're listening to just understand the piece of that history that allowed us to be in the work this way, and that there is community to be built if we lean into it. And I thank you for reading your words. Congratulations on this lifetime.
I also want to tell you something.
Yeah.
I flunked out of college.
I love that. You're sharing that right now. Well, I flunked speech class because I used to be so freaking shy, but yeah.
No, and it was around trauma. I told you about, what happened to me in Eastern Europe, and 6 months later, my father and my grandfather died the same week, and then another friend, and I just shut down. But I didn't want to embarrass. My mother was grieving. I didn't know the word trauma or PTSD or mental health. I didn't know anything. So I just shut down. And no adult came to check on me. And other students didn't know what to do because I was sitting in my room smoking Newports, buying into all that advertising.
Okay.
No drugs, no alcohol, nothing like that. But that loneliness that also came about. So again, we can't put people on pedestals. It took me 8 years to get my undergraduate degree. And, I had to go back to school. I ran away to Colorado, like all kinds of things happen. We live lives. I think those stories are just as important. So we can talk about my lifetime achievement, but if I think about people who step by step also moved me along the path, and when I think about my failures, they're just as important.
Well, that right there was the money, if they say, right? Like that, because I think that we live in this way. Leadership will have you pretending that everything is okay and you have all the answers and everything, right? Like I'm talking about my week. It's not about that election. It's about, people's lives that have transitioned into ancestors, right?
Mhm.
That becomes less important to me. And the grief that I'm holding while trying to do work, it's something that I've grown accustomed to, but I don't want to be accustomed to it in a way that shows up as false strength.
Yeah.
That's disingenuous, and it doesn't help leaders that are coming to be able to honor all of their selves as they're experiencing the work.
Right.
So I hope that we just continue to find spaces where leadership can be seen as more of an act of liberation than it is today,
And asking for help.
and asking for
The
help.
biggest lesson I had to learn was at some point I had to say I need help. Or I had to say I don't have the faintest idea what I'm doing.
Yeah. Do you feel like you're going to know how to do retirement?
No, but I am committed to it. I am committed. I got an email today, somebody reaching out, an amazing board that they wanted me to join. And I had to remember that no is a complete sentence. I was like, I am committed to a year of radical rest. I am committed to that. I won't be able to think or do or be until I slough off all of these layers of what I do to who I am. Right. And so, no, I'm going to be open to possibility, and I'm going to be grateful for the fact that life isn't going to be fancy for me or luxurious. Folks ask me, oh, are you going to take a big trip? I'm like, the word trip exhausts me in and of itself, and it's expensive, right? I'm going to go, one of my dearest, dearest friends, going back to before I got kicked out of college. She was actually my roommate, and who loved me in the midst of it. But she lives in Jamaica 6 months out of the year. I'm going to be still. I can be in her home. I can be loved. I can be myself. We can laugh. We can do whatever we need to do. And then I'm going to just make it up along the way. I'm going to make it up. But whatever it is will make me feel in whatever way it is that I am contributing to something. I just don't know what it'll look like.
Well, I can't wait to see what manifests. And I hope that stillness allows you to recognize all that you have done to this point, and that it gives you the space to connect the dots for whatever's next.
Thank you. I love that.
Thank you for joining me.
Oh, it was my pleasure. You're an absolute gift, and I am honored to have been asked by you and Toya. I'm honored.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Centering Conversations. Thank you for tuning in and centering yourself with us today. Remember, your voice has power, your vision has purpose, and your values guide your leadership and the way forward. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and stay connected for more conversations that inspire, ignite, and empower. Until next time, keep calling forth your purpose and centering your power.